Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. We have brought down the eventful story of this little city to the time when it formed an alliance with Bern and Freiburg. This brought it a little help in the battle which it had maintained hitherto single-handed against tremendous odds. The Duke had left it, and placed the Alps between himself and it, but he had not lost sight of it. Despairing of being able to reduce it by his own power, he sent a messenger to Charles V at Augsburg, entreating him to send his soldiers and to put him in possession of Geneva. Most willingly would the emperor have put these haughty citizens under the feet of the Duke, but his own hands were at the moment too full to attempt any new enterprise. The Lutheran princes of Germany, as stubborn in their own way as the Genevans were in theirs, were occasioning Charles a world of anxiety, and he could give the Duke nothing but promises. The emperor's plan, as communicated to the Duke's envoy, was first to crush the German Protestants, and then bring his mailed hand down on the Huguenots of Geneva. Geneva, meanwhile, had respite. The Treaty of Nuremberg shortly afterwards set Charles V free on the side of Germany, and left him at liberty to convert the promises he had made to the Duke into deeds. But the hour to strike had now passed. A mightier power than the Emperor had entered Geneva. Returning from the Waldensian synod in the valley of Agrogna in October 1532, Farel, who was accompanied by Saunier, could not resist his long-cherished desire of visiting Geneva. His arrival was made known to the Friends of Liberty in that city, and the very next day the elite of the citizens waited on him at his inn, the Tour Pierce, on the left bank of the Rhone. He preached twice, setting forth the glorious gospel of the grace of God. The topic of his first address was Holy Scripture, the fountainhead of all divine knowledge, in contradistinction to the tradition of the Fathers, or decree of council, and the only authority on earth to which the conscience of man was subject. This opened the gates of a higher liberty than these men had yet understood or aspired to. They had been shedding their blood for their franchises, but now the Reformer showed them a way by which their souls might escape from the dark dungeon in which tradition and human authority had succeeded in shutting them up. The next day Farel proclaimed to them the great pardon of God, which consisted, according to his exposition, in the absolutely free forgiveness of sinners bestowed on the footing of an absolutely full and perfect expiation of human guilt, and this he placed in studious opposition to the pardon of the Pope, which had to be bought with money or with penances. This was a still wider opening of the gates of a new world to these men. This, said Farel, is the gospel, and this, and nothing short of this, is liberty, inasmuch as it is the enfranchisement of the whole man, body, conscience, and soul. The words of the Reformer did not fall on dull or indifferent hearts. The generous soil, already watered with the blood of the martyrs of liberty, now received into its bosom a yet more precious seed. The old Geneva passed away, and in its place came a new Geneva. which the wiles of the Pope should not be able to circumvent, nor the arms of the Emperor to subdue. The priests learned, with a dismay bordering on despair, that the man who had passed like a devastating tempest over the Pays de Vaud, his track marked by altars overturned, images demolished, and canons, monks, and nuns fleeing before him in terror, had come hither also. What was to be done? Effectual steps must be promptly taken, otherwise all would be lost. The gods of Geneva would perish as those of Neuchâtel had done. Farel and Saunière were summoned before the town council. The majority of the magistrates received them with angry looks, some of them with bitter words, but happily Farel carried letters from their excellencies of Bern, with whom Geneva was in alliance, and whom the councillors feared to offend. The reformers, thus protected, after some conference, left the council chamber unharmed. Their acquittal awakened still more fears of the priests, and as their fear grew, so did their anger. Armed clerics were parading the streets. There was a great flutter in the convents. "A shabby little preacher," said one of the sisters of St. Clair, with a toss of the head. "Master William Farel has just arrived." The townspeople were breaking out in tumults. What next was thought of? An episcopal council met, and under a pretext of debating the question, it summoned the two preachers before them. Two magistrates accompanied them to see that they returned alive. Some of the episcopal council had come with arms under their sacerdotal robes. Such was their notion of a religious discussion. The reformers were asked by what authority they preached. Farel replied by quoting the divine injunction, "Preach the gospel to every creature." The meek majesty of the answer only provoked a sneer. In a few minutes the council became excited. The members started to their feet. They flung themselves upon the two evangelists. They pulled them about and spat upon them, exclaiming, "Come, Farel, you wicked devil, what makes you go up and down thus? Whence comest thou? What business brings you to our city to throw us into trouble?" When the noise had a little subsided, Farel made an answer courageously, "I am not a devil. I am sent by God as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. I preach Christ crucified, dead for our sins, risen again for our justification. He that believeth upon him hath eternal life. He that believeth not is condemned." "He blasphemes. He is worthy of death," exclaimed some. To the Rhone," shouted others. It were better to drown him in the Rhone than permit this wicked Lutheran to trouble all the people. "Speak the words of Christ, not of Caiaphas," replied Farel. This was the signal for a yet more ferocious outbreak. "Kill the Lutheran hound," exclaimed they. Donny Bergeri, proctor to the chaplain, cried, "Strike! Strike!" They closed round Farel and Saunière. They took hold of them. They struck at them. One of the Grand Vicar's servants, who carried a firearm, leveled it at Farel. He pulled the trigger. The priming flashed. The clatter of arms under the vestments of the priests foreboded a tragic issue to the affair, and doubtless it would have speedily terminated in this melancholy fashion, but for the vigorous interposition of the two magistrates. Rescued from the perils of the Episcopal Council Hall, worse dangers, if possible, threatened them outside. A miscellaneous crowd of clerics and laics, armed with clubs and swords, waited in the street to inflict upon the two heretics the vengeance which it was just possible they might escape at the hands of the vicar and canons. When the mob saw them appear, they brandished their weapons, and raising a frightful noise of hissing and howling, made ready to rush upon them. It looked as if they were fated to die on the spot. At the critical moment, a band of halberders, headed by the syndics, came up, and closing their ranks round the two reformers, escorted them through the scowling and hooting crowd to their inn, the Tour Pierce. A guard was stationed at the door all night. Next morning, at an early hour, appeared a few friends, who, taking Farel and Saunier and leading them to the shore of the lake, made them embark in a small boat, and, carrying them over the quiet waters, landed them at the Pays de Vaud, in an unfrequented spot between Morges and Lucerne. Thence Farel and Saunier went on to Grandson. Such was the issue of Farel's first essay in a city on which his eye and heart had so long rested. It did not promise much, but he had accomplished more than he at the moment knew. In fact, Farel was too powerful, and his name was of too great prestige, to begin the work. The seeds of such a work must be deposited by a gentle hand. They must grow up in a still air, and only when they have taken root may the winds be suffered to blow. Of this Farel seems to have become sensible, for we find him looking around for a humbler and feebler instrument to send to Geneva. He cast eyes on the young and not very courageous Froment, and dispatched him to a city where he himself had almost been torn in pieces. While Froment was on his way, another visitor unexpectedly appeared to the Genevans. A comet blazed forth in their sky. What did it portend? War, said some. The rising of a divine light, said others. No, Froment's appearance was so mean that even the Huguenots, as the friends of liberty and progress in Geneva were styled, turned their backs upon him. What was he to do? Froment recalled Farel's example at Aigle, and resolved to turn schoolmaster. He hired a room at the Croix d'Or, near the Mollard, and speedily his fame as a teacher of youth filled Geneva. The lessons Froment taught the children in the school, the children taught the parents when they went home. Gradually, and in a very short while, the class grew into a congregation of adults, the schoolroom into a church, and the teacher into an evangelist. Reading out a chapter, he would explain it with simplicity and impressiveness. Thus did he scatter the seed upon hearts. Souls were converted, and the once despised evangelist, who had been, like a greater missionary, a root out of dry ground to the Genevans, now saw crowds pressing round him and drinking in his words. This was in the end of the year 1532. The work proceeded apace. Among the converts were certain rich and honorable women. We mention especially Paula, the wife of John Levet, and Claudine, her sister-in-law. Their conversation made a great sensation in Geneva. By their means their husbands and many of the acquaintances were drawn to hear the schoolmaster at the Croix d'Or, and embraced the gospel. From the Pays de Vaud arrived New Testaments, tracts, and controversial works, and these, distributed among the citizens, opened the eyes of many who had not courage to go openly to the schoolmaster's sermon. Tradesmen and people of all conditions enrolled themselves among the disciples. The social principle of Christianity began to operate. Those who were of the one faith drew together into one society, and meeting at stated times in one another's houses, they strove to instruct and strengthen each other. Such were the early days of the Genevan Church. First came faith in the free forgiveness of the gospel. Next came good works. A reformation of manners followed in Geneva. The Reformed ceased to frequent those fashionable amusements in which they had formerly delighted. They banished finery from their dress, and luxury from their banquets. They made no more costly presents to the saints, and the money thus saved they bestowed on the poor, and especially the Protestant exiles, whom the rising storms of persecution in France compelled to flee to the gates of Geneva as to a harbor of refuge. There was hardly a Protestant of note who did not receive into his house one of these expatriated Christians, and in this way Geneva learned that hospitality for which it is renowned to this day. The congregation of Froment in a few weeks grew too large for the modest limits of the Croix d'Or. One day greater concourse than usual, assembling at his chapel door and pressing in vain for admittance, the cry was raised, "To the Mallard!" To the Mallard the crowd marched, carrying with them the preacher. It was New Year's Day, 1533. The Mallard was the market square, and here, mounted on a fish stall, the first public pulpit in Geneva, Froment preached to the multitude. It was his New Year's gift, as it had been called. Having prayed, he began his sermon by announcing that free pardon, the ray from the open heavens which leads the eye upward to the throne of a Savior, which all the reformers, treading in the steps of the apostles, placed in the foreground of their teaching. From this he went on to present to his hearers the lineaments of the false prophets and idolatrous priests, as painted in the Old and New Testaments, pointing out the exact verification of these features in the Romish hierarchy of their own day. Froment's delineations were so minute, so graphic and fearless, that his hearers saw the prophets of Baal and the Pharisees of a corrupt Judaism living over again in the priests of their own city. The preacher had become warm in his theme, and the audience were kindling in sympathy, when a sound of hurrying footsteps was heard behind them. On turning around, a band of armed men was seen entering the square. The lieutenant of the city, the procurator fiscal, the soldiers, and a number of armed priests, exasperated by this public manifestation of the converts, had come to arrest Froment and disperse the assembly. Had the preacher been captured, it is not doubtful what his fate would have been. But the band returned without their prey. His friends carried him off to a place of hiding. The agitation of the citizens and the violence of the priests made the farther prosecution of Froment's ministry in Geneva hopeless. He withdrew quietly from the city and returned to his former charge in the village of Vonand, at the foot of the Jura. The foundations of Protestant Geneva had been laid. Greater builders were to rear the edifice. Chapter 6. Geneva on the brink of civil war. First Communion in Geneva. Plot to massacre all the converts. Canon Warnley. The Roman Catholics take arms. The city on the brink of civil war. The battle averted. Another storm. Canon Warnley arms and rings the Toscan. He is slain. Byrne interposes. The council permits by edict the free preaching of the gospel in Geneva. The Pope commands the bishop to return to the city. He blunders and retires. Froment returns. Farel and Farel arrive in Geneva. Dejection of the Roman Catholics. The workmen had retired, but the work went on. The Protestants, now grown to a goodly number, and full of zeal and hope, met in each other's houses, the catacombs of the young church, as an old author styles these meetings. They read the scriptures in Lefebvre's translation. They elected Guerin, one of the more intelligent and esteemed among them, to the charge of the word, in the room of Froment. And they still further strengthened their bond of union by partaking together of the Lord's Supper. It occasioned them some anxiety where they should find a spot sufficiently secluded for the celebration of the ordinance. The place ultimately made choice of was a little walled garden near the city gates. The time of year was the middle of March. The preparations were simple indeed. A few benches, a table spread with a white cloth, on which were displayed the bread and wine that were to become to these disciples the memorials of Christ's death, and the token and seal of their interest in its blessings. Guerin took his seat at the head of the table and began the service. At that moment the sun, rising over the Alps, shed his first rays upon the little company, an outward emblem of the real though spiritual presence of that Savior of whom it was foretold. His coming like the morn shall be, like morning songs his voice. This seemed to them an auspicious token. The growing numbers and zeal of the disciples again drew upon them the anger of the priests, and Guerin had to withdraw and follow Froment into exile at Vonand. Geneva, like a ship laboring in a tempestuous sea, was casting out one Protestant laborer after another, but it could not cast out the gospel. Bern next appeared on the stage. It demanded that its ally Geneva should grant liberty to the preaching of the gospel in it. The friends of the Duke and of Rome, the Mamelukes as they were called, saw that matters had come to a crisis. They must extirpate Lutheranism from Geneva, otherwise they should never be at rest. But Lutheranism they could hope to extirpate not otherwise than by extirpating all the Lutherans. The council hesitated and procrastinated, for the majority of its members were still Roman Catholics, but the canons, priests, and chief partisans of Romanism neither hesitated nor procrastinated. They met in the Vicar General's Council Hall, Thursday, 27th May, 1533. They came armed to the teeth, and the issue of their deliberations, which were conducted by torchlight, was to kill all the Protestants in Geneva without one exception. The conspirators, raising their hands, bound themselves by a solemn oath. They now dispersed for a brief repose, for the plot was to be executed on the day following. The morrow came, and the conspirators assembled in the cathedral to the number of 700. The first to enter was Canon Wernley. He came clad in armor. He was as devoted a Romanist as he was a redoubtable warrior. He was a Samson for strength, and could wield his battle-axe as he might fling about his breviary. In raging war with the hydra of heresy which had broken into the Roman Catholic fold of Geneva, he would strike once, and would not strike a second time. This zealous priest and valiant soldier was the real captain of the band, which was ostensibly led by Syndic Baud, in his great hat and plume of feathers, having marshaled in front of the high altar of St. Peter's. His troop, which included 300 armed priests, put itself in motion, with banners displayed, crosses uplifted, axes and swords brandished, while the great bell of the cathedral sent forth its startling and ominous peals. It marched down the street of the Perron to the Mollard, and drew up in battle array. Various armed detachments continued to arrive from other quarters, and their junction ultimately swelled the Roman Catholic host to about 2,500. They felt sure of victory. Here they stood, their cannon and firearms loaded, awaiting the word for action, and chafing at those little hindrances which ever and anon occurred to keep them back from battle, as chafes the war horse against the bit that curbs his fiery impatience to plunge into the fight. This army, drawn up in order of battle in the Mollard, received a singular reinforcement. The wives and mothers of the Romanists appeared on the scene of action, their aprons filled with stones. By their side their little children, of from 12 to 14, whom they had brought to take part in this holy war, and into whose hands they had put such weapons as they were able to wield. So great was the zeal of these Amazons against heresy. Meanwhile, what were the Protestants doing or thinking? At the first alarm they assembled in the house of Baudicon de la Maisonneuve, one of the most courageous of their leaders. His mansion was situated on the left bank of the Rhone, some 400 paces from the Mollard. The converts felt how terrible was the crisis, but their hearts were fixed, trusting on him who holds the tempests and whirlwinds in his hands. He had but to speak, and that storm would dispel as suddenly as it had gathered. The plan of the Romanists was to march to Baudicon's house, set fire to it, and massacre the heretics one by one as they escaped from the flames. The proposal of burning them came to the ears of the Protestants. Their numbers had now considerably increased. All were well armed and of good courage. They resolved to march out and stand for their lives. Descending into the street, they drew up 5 deep, in presence of the enemy. There was deep stillness. It would be broken the next moment by the shock of murderous battle. The cannons and firearms were loaded, the halberds grasped, the swords unsheathed, and stones and other missiles were ready to be poured in to complete the work of death. But it pleased the great Disposer to stay the tempest when it seemed on the very point of bursting. There chanced at that time to be 7 Freiburg merchants sojourning in Geneva. Touched by the lamentable spectacle of the citizens in arms to shed one another's blood, they came forward at the critical moment to meditate. Blessed are the peacemakers. Going first to the Roman Catholics and then to the Reformed, they represented to the former how foolish it was to shed their blood to satisfy the appetite of their priests, and pointed out to the latter how tremendous were the odds that stood arrayed against them. With much ado they succeeded in calming the passions of both parties. The priests, however, of whom 160 were in arms, refused to lend an ear to these pacific counsels. But finding that if they persisted they should have to fight it out by themselves, they at last came to terms. The insane fury of the inhabitants having now given place to the natural affections, tears of joy welcomed fathers and husbands as at night they stepped across the thresholds of their homes. Terms of pacification were afterwards drawn up, which left the balance inclining somewhat in favor of liberty of conscience. But soon again another storm darkened over that city, within which 2 mighty principles were contending. The magistrates might issue edicts, the leaders of the 2 parties might sign pacifications, but settled peace there could be none for Geneva until the gospel should have established its sway in the hearts of a majority of its citizens. On the 4th of May, just 5 weeks after the affair we have just narrated, another tumult broke out. Its instigator was the same bellicose ecclesiastic who figured so prominently on the 28th of March, Canon Wernley. This good champion of the faith, as Sister Janine, who kept a journal of these occurrences, calls him, had at that moment celebrated with unusual pomp the feast of the Holy Winding Sheet in St. Peter's. Taking off his sacerdotal robes, he put on his breastplate and cushies, belted his sword to his side, seized his heavy halberd, and issued forth to do battle for the church, followed by a party of priests to whose hands the firearm came quite as readily as the breviary. Wernley strolled down the perron to his old battlefield, the Mallard. By this time night had fallen. Alarming rumors were propagated through the city, and to add to the terror of the inhabitants, the Toscan began to ring out its thundering peals. Many on both sides, Roman Catholics and Reformers, mostly armed, rushed into the streets. There Canon Wernley, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, was shouting out to his assailants to come on. But as no one answered the challenge, he fell to dealing blows right and left among the crowd. Someone slipped behind him, and espying an opening in his iron coat, thrust his poniard into his body. The shout ceased. The tumult gradually subsided. The night passed, and when the morning broke, Canon Wernley was found lying in his armor, on the doorsteps of one of the houses, stark dead. If the death of this papal champion lessened the dangers of the Reformed within the city, it multiplied their enemies without. Wormley belonged to a powerful family of the Popish canton of Freiburg, and ambassadors from that state now appeared at Geneva demanding the punishment of all concerned in the canon's death, that is, of all the Reformed. The Reformation seemed about to be sacrificed on the tomb of Wormley, Protestant Bern instantly stepping forward in its defense. Bern proved itself the more powerful. Its ambassadors induced the syndics and council, as the only escape from the chaos that encompassed them, to proclaim liberty to all to abide by the Mass, or to follow Protestantism as their conscience might dictate. This decree, which advanced the landmarks of liberty theoretically, but hardly as yet practically, brought matters to a head in Geneva. For some time many eyes had been watching from abroad the struggle going on in this little town on the shores of the Leman. The extraordinary bravery and energy of its citizens had invested it with a charm that riveted upon it the eye of both friend and foe, and inspired them with the presentiment that it had a great part to play in the new times that were opening. It caused many an hour of anxious thought to Clement VII in the Vatican. Charles V could not but wonder that, while so many great kingdoms owned his sway, this little city resisted his will. He had written to these haughty burghers temporarily commanding them to forsake the evil paths of heresy. They had gone their own way notwithstanding. Strong measures must be taken with this rebellious town. Its prince-bishop, Pierre de la Baume, was absent from Geneva, and had been so for some while. The free manners of the citizens did not suit him, and he took up his abode at Arbois, on the other side of the Jura, in a quiet neighborhood where the wine was good. The prince-bishop cared for his church, of course, but he cared also for his dinner. But Geneva was on the point of being lost, and the Pope, at the risk of spoiling the bishop's digestion, ordered him, under pain of excommunication, to return there and try his hand at reducing to their obedience his mutinous subjects. Pierre de la Baume had but little heart for the task, but it was enjoined upon him under a threat which he trembled to incur, and so, provided with an armed escort, he returned, the 1st of July, 1533, to Geneva. But he helped to ruin the cause he had come to uphold. He would give Lutheranism not an open execution, but a secret burial. Accordingly, inviting the chiefs of the Protestant movement to his palace, no sooner had they entered it than the bishop closed the doors, threw his guests into irons, and proceeded to dispose of them by consigning one to this dungeon and another to that. In this summary proceeding of their bishop, the council saw a flagrant violation of the franchises of Geneva. It was the attack on liberty, not religion, for 3 of the 4 syndics were still Roman Catholic. That awakened their indignation. The senators produced their ancient charter, which the bishop had sworn to observe, and claimed the constitutional right in which it vested them of trying all inculpated citizens. The bishop found himself caught in the trap he had so cunningly set for others. If he should open his dungeons, he would confess to having sustained a most humiliating defeat. If he should retain his prisoners in bonds, he would draw upon his head one of those popular tempests of which he was so greatly afraid. Choosing the former as the less formidable alternative, he gave up his prisoners to their lawful judges. But even this did not restore the bishop's tranquility. His guilty imagination was continually conjuring up tumults and assassinations, and fleeing, when no man pursued, he secretly quitted Geneva just 14 days after he had entered it. He left the cause of Rome in a worse position than he had found it, and the Pope saw that he had better have left the craven bishop to enjoy his quiet and his wine at Arbois. When the shepherd of the flock had fled, what so likely to happen as that the wolf would return? The wolf did return, Froment, with a companion by his side. Alexander Canis reappeared on the scene which the bishop had been in such haste to quit. These evangelists preached in private houses, and when these no longer sufficed for the crowds that assembled, they proclaimed the good news in the streets. The bishop, who learned what was going on, fulminated a missive from his quiet asylum, in the hope of driving the destroyer out of the fold he had deserted. Why, said the Genevans, did he not remain and keep the door closed? The priest complained to the council, laying the bishop's letter upon the table. The remonstrance only served to show how that the tide was rising. Preach the gospel, answered the council, and say nothing that cannot be proved by Holy Scripture. These words, which are still to be read in the city registers, made Protestantism a religio licita, a tolerated faith, in Geneva. The bishop, in his own way, threw oil upon the fire by a second and more energetic letter, forbidding the preaching in Geneva, secretly or publicly, of the holy page, of the holy gospel. Further, Furbity, a frothy and abusive preacher of the Dominican order, was brought to oppose the Reformed. The violence of his harangues evoked a popular tumult, and the waters of liberty, retreating for a moment from the limits which they had reached, Froment and Canis had to retire from Geneva. But speedily the tide turned, this time to overpass a long way its furthest limits hitherto. On the 21st of December, 1533, Farel entered the gates of Geneva, not again to leave it until the Reformation had been consummated in it. The Roman Catholics felt that a life and death struggle had commenced. The citizens assembled to the sermons of Farel with helmets on their heads, and firearms and halberds in their hands. The priest, divining the true source of the movement, published from all the pulpits on the 1st of January, 1534, an order commanding all copies of the Bible, whether in French or in German, to be burned. For 3 days and nights the city was under arms, the one party arming to defend, the other to expel the Bible. Froment arrived to the help of Farel. There came yet another, Farel, who joined them in a few weeks. Farel, Farel, Froment, the three most powerful preachers in the French tongue, are now in Geneva. These three are an army. Their weapon is the Word of God. Clad in the panoply of light and wielding the sword of the Spirit, these three warriors will do more to batter down the stronghold of Rome than all the 900 priests in Geneva can do to uphold it. The knell of the papacy has sounded in this city. Low, responsive wailing began to be heard along the foot of the Alps and the crest of the Jura, mourning the approaching fall of an ancient system. The echoes travel to France, to England, and to Germany, and wherever they come, the friends of the gospel and of liberty look up, while the adherents of Rome hang their heads, weighed down by the presentiment of a terrible disaster about to befall their cause. Chapter 7. Heroism of Geneva. Conspiracy against Geneva. Detection. Protestants gain possession of one of the churches. The gospel in Geneva. Glories near but unseen. An army of pilgrims. A hunting party. The game not caught. Roman Catholic exodus. The Duke and the Emperor combine against Geneva. Perils of the city. Heroic resolution of the citizens. The suburbs demolished. The citizens wait the assault. Geneva had much to dare and to endure during the year and a half that was yet to elapse before its struggles should be crowned with victory. Three powerful parties, the Prince Bishop, the Duke of Savoy, and their excellencies of Freiburg, jointly conspired against the liberties of the brave little town. The bishop secretly appointed a lieutenant general to govern in his name, investing him with all the powers of the state. The duke sent blank warrants to be filled in with the names of those whom it might be necessary to apprehend and execute, and the lords of Freiburg were to cooperate with the Mamelukes within the city. All was excellently planned, but the blow which the bishop meditated against the state of Geneva fell upon himself and his accomplices. The plot was discovered. The agents who were to have executed it suffered the doom of traitors. The bishop, caught plotting, became nearly as odious to the Roman Catholics as he already was to the Protestants. The popular reaction which ensued filled the curule chairs at next election with the friends of the reform. The reformers, now numerous, and taunted sometimes with worshipping in holes and corners, resolved no longer to submit to the stigma of being obliged to celebrate their worship in private houses. They said to the magistrates, "Give us one of the churches of the city." The council, wishing to hold the balance even between them and the Roman Catholics, excused themselves by saying that this was a matter that lay outside their jurisdiction. But, added they, you are strong, and if you are pleased to take one of the churches of your own accord, we cannot prevent you. The converts did not delay to act upon the hint. The brave Baudicon de la Maisonneuve marched at their head. They proceeded to the convent of the Rive, and appropriated for their use the grand auditory, or cloister, which might contain from 4,000 to 5,000 persons. They rang the bells. The report ran that Farel was to preach, and the crowds from every part of the city came streaming to the Rive. The monks could only stare. Rising up in his ordinary dress, Farel preached to the overflowing congregation. That was a day much to be remembered in Geneva. It needs neither many nor learned words to proclaim the gospel. It is a message from the throne of heaven to the guilty children of the earth, to this effect, that God, having sent his Son to suffer in their room, offers them free pardon. The Genevans were amazed to find that the gospel was so simple a matter, and could be so soon told. They had been taught from their cradle that it needed gorgeous cathedrals, blazing tapers, splendidly apparelled priests, chants, and incense to set it forth, and that wanting mystic rites it refused to impart its efficacy to the worshipper. Now they found that one attired in a plain dress and in a single plain sentence could declare it all. But that little sentence they found was a ray that revealed to them a whole world of glory. The chant of the priest had entered the ear only. Farel's words sunk into the heart. The taper had but flashed its light on the eye. The gospel shed its glory on the soul. The moral phenomenon was now accomplished before this people, analogous to the natural one which often takes place in this same region. So long as the mists and clouds veil the Alps, these mountains, even to the men living at their feet, are as if they did not exist. But let the clouds lift, or let a breeze make an opening in the mist, and lo, a world of alpine grandeurs is suddenly revealed to the eye of the spectator. A moment ago there hung before him a curtain of dull vapor. Now there is seen a glorious array of mountains, with their gorges, rocks, and pine forests, their snows and flashing pinnacles. As near, yet unseen, were the evangelical glories of the spiritual world to the Genevans. These glories were completely hidden by the black cloud of ignorance and superstition that hung between them and the Bible. But the moment that cloud began to be parted by the preaching of the gospel and the breath of the Spirit, a new world was disclosed, a world of truth. It stood out distinct, palpable, complete in an affluence of spiritual glory and a fullness of moral power, which made the Genevans wonder what blinding influence it was that had hidden from their eye what was all the time so near and yet so entirely unseen. The gospel had entered Geneva. The city was taken. How much the Reformation had gained, and how much Rome had lost in the conquest of that little town, future years were to enable men fully to understand. But the Protestants of Geneva had many efforts and sacrifices yet to undergo if they would retain the victory which had in reality been won. Geneva was far too important a post for the Romanists to let it slip without another great effort. This was resolved upon. In the middle of May, the priests of the surrounding districts organized a great procession of pilgrims who knew how to handle other things than their rosaries. The pious troop appeared at the gates of Geneva, duly furnished with banners, crosses, and relics. But the citizens, recollecting the story of the Trojan horse, and fearing that if the pilgrims entered, their devotions might take a militant turn, and the war cry be raised for the psalm, refused to admit the devout host. They could pray outside the walls. So this danger passed away. The next army that marched to assail the little town, where the light of the gospel was burning more brightly every day, came not in the guise of pilgrims, but of soldiers. The bishop had formed a new plot. The Romanist lords of Vaud and Savoy, at the instigation of the bishop and the duke, had arranged a hunting party for the last day of July 1534, the real game which the armed sportsmen meant to run down being the Genevan Lutherans. The papists within the city were to act in concert with those without. Some 300 armed foreigners had been secretly introduced into the town. The keeper of the artillery had been bribed. The midnight signals agreed upon, and the bishop, dividing the prey before he had caught it, had confiscated, in favor of his followers, the goods of the Genevan heretics. In short, everything had been done to ensure success. The night came. The peasants of the surrounding country, having armed themselves, began to move on Geneva, some by land, others by water. The bailiff of Chablaisas and the Baron de Rollo alone led 8,000 men. The papists in the city had armed secretly and were assembling in one another's houses. The citizens, all save the accomplices of the bishop, were ignorant of the plot, and many of them had already gone to rest as usual. All was progressing as the invaders wished. But that Providence, which had been plowing this field for more than 20 years, was not to abandon it to an enemy at the very moment when the seed which had been sown in it was shooting up, and the harvest at hand. A friend of the gospel, Jacques Maubuisson, from Dauphine, solicited an interview with the premier syndic at an early hour of the evening. He was admitted, and startled the magistrate by telling him that the city was surrounded with armed men. Instantly the citizens were aroused and got under arms. The host outside the walls were meanwhile straining their eyes to catch through the darkness the first gleam of the torches, which were to be waved on the tops of the houses of their friends as the signal to begin the assault. All suddenly a brilliant light shone forth from the summit of the steeple of St. Peter's. That was the place, the invaders knew, where the city watch were usually stationed. It was plain the plot had been discovered. "We are betrayed, we are betrayed," they exclaimed. "We shall never enter Geneva." Fiercer and yet fiercer, as it seemed to the eyes of the Savoyans, glared that beacon light. Panic seized their ranks, and when the morning broke, the citizens of Geneva beheld from their steeples and ramparts the armies of their invaders in full retreat. By the time the sun rose, the last foe had disappeared. As a dream, short but terrible, so did the events of that night appear to the Genevans. The miscarriage of the plot was followed by an exodus of Romanists from the city. Many of the Mamelukes, as they were termed, fled, and thus their priests were left without flocks, the churches without worshippers, and the images without votaries. The Protestants were more than ever masters of the situation. In the final struggles of the papacy in Geneva, we behold what has since been repeated in our own day on the wider arena of Europe, that every attempt to raise it up has only helped to cast it down. Yet another effort, that is, as things were going with the papacy, another plunge, the last and the deepest. The Duke and the Bishop were but the more enraged by their repeated discomfitures. They resolved that they would extinguish Lutheranism, or sweep the little town in which it had entrenched itself from off its rock, and make it, like old Tyre, a place for the spreading of nets by the shore of its lake. Considering the resources which the Duke had at his command, neither he nor anyone else could see how he should not be able to do his pleasure upon the audacious little city. Geneva had an enemy, it may be said, in every man outside her walls. The castle that hemmed her in on all sides were filled with armed men ready to march at the first summons. Before beginning the war which was to make the rebellious town put its haughty neck under his feet, Duke Charles III sent his ultimatum to the citizens. They must send away their preachers, Farel, Farel, and Froment. They must take back their bishop and return within the bosom of their holy mother, the Church. On these terms the Duke, good and kind man, would give them his forgiveness. The Genevans made answer that sooner than do this, they would bury themselves beneath the ruins of their city. Even their good ally Bern, despairing of their success, or else gained by the flatteries of the Duke, counseled the Genevans to submit. A diet of the Swiss canons met at Lucerne in January 1535 to determine the matter. They had no other advice to give Geneva than submission. This was unspeakably disappointing, but worse was behind. The great Emperor Charles V came forward and announced that he cast his sword into the scale of the Duke. The cause of Geneva, already desperate, was now hopeless, apparently. Could this little town of only 12,000 inhabitants resist the empire? Could the Genevans stand alone against the world? All help has failed them on earth. Nevertheless, their resolution is as inflexible as ever. Geneva shall be a sanctuary of the Protestant faith and a citadel of liberty, or its sons will set fire to its four corners and make it their own funeral pile. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.